magnitude 6.0 in Australia. Is this coming from the 3 magnitude 7 plus 7.6, 7.3 earthquakes that just happened? And does New Zealand have to worry about this? Because they're on the same plate boundary. So massive earthquakes just hit Vanuatu, Tonga, Indonesia, now in the middle of Australia. So could this affect New Zealand? The answer is not what you think, guys, because yes, they are connected, but not in the way most people believe. So let me show you why this is more complicated than it looks. You need to know that. Something crazy just happened in Australia. Yeah, right in the middle, if you look at it, not completely in the middle, but that is really, really strange. And it really shouldn't be happening like this. So we have seen, I've reported about 3 magnitude 7 plus earthquakes that were happening somewhat nearby if you look at the map. So is this related? Because a magnitude 6 earthquake just struck in the northern territory of Australia, like deep in the middle of the continent, nowhere near a plate boundary. So why? Where is this coming from? And that it is not near a plate boundary. This is exactly why this matters, because Australia is supposed to be one of the most stable pieces of crust on Earth. And then, you know, this is not like a 1.5 or something like this, like 6.0, even if they downgrade it to 5 point something. This is remarkable. So let's break this down. In the middle of nowhere, Australia sits on the Indo-Australian Plate, but here's what most people don't realize, I have to say. This plate is under massive stress, but usually we see this along the plate boundaries, Pacific Ring of Fire, where you see where that located, where Australia is located, right? That's why we've seen trouble in Tonga, Vanuatu, and Indonesia, and very, very strong trouble there right now. So what is happening? But before I tell you that, please guys, can you give this video an early like and hype? It doesn't cost you anything. It helps my channel. Thank you so much. Let's look into this now. So the Indo-Australian Plate is under a lot of stress. We cannot ignore that massive stress because it's pushed from the north where it's colliding with Southeast Asia, and it's being pulled and twisted along its boundaries with the Pacific Plate, Pacific Ring of Fire. And that stress just doesn't stay on the edges. It travels thousands of miles straight through the interior of the plate. Now, Central Australia is also full of ancient fault systems. So we're talking about faults that formed hundreds of millions of years ago from old mountain building events like the Alice Springs orogeny, for example. So these faults are basically, we call them like sleeping cracks in the Earth's crust. So they're locked, they're compressed, but they're never fully gone. So they're never fully gone until stress builds up enough, and then they suddenly reactivate. So that's what's likely what this is, what we're seeing here in Australia. It's basically, we call this an intraplate rupture. It's along one of these buried fault systems, possibly linked to structures that are in this area where the epicenter is, the Red Bank Thrust Zone faults within the Amadeus Basin. Amadeus Basin sounds really, really nice. But here's what makes this even more important in my opinion. Earthquakes in stable continental crust tend to travel much farther. So because the rock is older, it's colder, it's more rigid. So the seismic waves don't lose the energy quickly. So that means shaking from this event that we've just seen could have been felt hundreds of miles away. And we also have to talk about the depth of this earthquake because that matters regarding how much it is felt. So the early data suggests that it wasn't extremely shallow. So likely somewhere in the 10 to 30 kilometer range, like roughly something like 7 to 23 miles sort of thing. it's still considered shallow, but it wasn't like 3 miles, 5 miles, right? It's deep enough to spread energy wide, but it's still shallow enough to be strongly felt near the source. So near the source, we have to talk population and infrastructure. So thankfully, this is one of the most remote parts of Australia. The closest reference point, as you see on the map, is Alice Springs. Beyond that, sparse communities like desert terrain, so major damage is very unlikely, but that doesn't mean this is insignificant. We have to make that very, very clear, because the real question is, why now? Why now? And if you've seen my previous videos about these 3 magnitude 7 earthquakes, you might already getting what I'm hinting at. So, especially why now? With everything else happening around the Indo-Pacific region, and the Indonesia earthquake that we just had has already aftershocks, 400 plus aftershocks. It's absolutely crazy. So multiple magnitude 7 plus earthquakes in places, Tonga, Vanuatu, Indonesia, a lot of aftershocks also in the magnitude 6 range. So all along the Pacific Ring of Fire, right? That doesn't surprise us. So now, technically, those earthquakes are subduction zone earthquakes, right? Completely different mechanism. Those happen where the plates are being subducted underneath each other. One plate is diving underneath the other one. So, but this one here, where we have that earthquake, that is not the case. So subduction is not a direct trigger. But here's where it gets interesting. The Indian-Australian or Indo-Australian plate is not acting as one solid plate anymore. There is strong scientific evidence that it's actually fragmenting. So fragmenting, if it does that, that changes the narrative. And that's very, very interesting. If it's breaking into smaller blocks, the Indian plate, the Australian plate, and a diffuse deformation zone in between. This means stress is no longer distributed evenly. It's building up internally. And Central Australia sits right in that region, in a region where that stress can accumulate over time. So while this earthquake is not directly caused by the Tonga, Vanuatu, or Indonesia earthquake, they're all part of a larger tectonic system that is currently very active. And if we have a big earthquake, magnitude 7 plus, seismic waves travel. And if we have a fault system or an old crack that is already like locked and loaded or has built up stress, a seismic wave coming from a magnitude 7 could be the last trigger to trigger that as well, right? I want to say that when we start seeing large subduction earthquakes and unusual intraplate earthquakes like this one within the same broader plate system, that's when you have to pay attention, because it suggests that the entire region is under elevated stress. We have to look at New Zealand for a second. So can that stress trigger some of the dangerous faults in New Zealand? New Zealand has a lot of earthquakes. Short answer, no, not in any direct way or immediate way, but I don't dismiss it completely either, because there is a deeper connection that definitely exists and that we cannot ignore. So New Zealand sits right on the boundary between the Indo-Australian plate and the Pacific plate. So this is major active plate boundary, not a stable interior like Australia. We have the Alpine fault, massive strike slip fault on the South Island. We have the Hikurangi subduction zone. Pacific plate is diving under New Zealand, the North Island. So this area is already highly stressed, constant moving, regularly producing large earthquake. Tonga, Kermadec Trench is there. That's basically, if you look at the map, directly north of New Zealand. Vanuatu, further west, but still interacting. Indonesia, collision zone of multiple plates. So they're all part of the Pacific Plate plus the Indo-Australian Plate interaction zone. So yes, they are connected. But here's the critical distinction. Can these M7 plus earthquakes trigger New Zealand? Almost always no, almost, right? Even large earthquakes, they lose stress impact quickly with distance. We know that they mainly affect areas within a few hundred miles. New Zealand is roughly 4,000 miles from Indonesia, 1,000 to 2,000 miles from Tonga, Vanuatu. So that is too far for direct stress transfer. But here's where it gets interesting and real. The Tonga Kermadec is the key link. So this is not random. Tonga sits on the same subduction system that continues down to New Zealand. This becomes the Kermadec Trench, the Hikurangi subduction zone. So this is literally one continuous plate boundary. So if we have large earthquakes in Tonga Kermadec, which we have, it can slightly change the stress along the same boundary system, right? But as I said again, the effects weaken with distance, and the timing is unpredictable. So science actually is telling us we have two real mechanisms that we're dealing with. We have the static stress transfer that is important, but it's local, right? It works over short distances, roughly 200 miles, not enough to jump from Tonga to New Zealand. Dynamic stress waves, that's the second thing that is the subtle one. Seismic waves do travel across the planet. They can nudge faults that are already close to failure. Maybe that's what happened in Australia. So this has been observed globally. It's happening, right? Sometimes distance quakes can trigger small earthquakes or tremor. Very rarely, they may advance timing slightly, right? The fault is ready to break. But it does not cause a big New Zealand earthquake. It only matters if the fault was or is already critically stressed. Then it could. Indonesia specifically, we got to talk about that one because that was the last magnitude 7 plus magnitude. Indonesia is a completely different, complex plate collision zone. It's not directly connected to New Zealand faults in a continuous boundary. So for the Indonesia earthquakes, they do not meaningfully influence New Zealand. So these massive earthquakes in Tonga and the Southwest Pacific, they are not random. They sit along the same tectonic system that connects directly to New Zealand. But, and this is important, they do not directly trigger earthquakes there. What they can do is they send stress waves through the system. And if a fault in New Zealand is already close to failure, yes, it could advance the timing. I do not want to fall into this because that's not true. We cannot say everything is connected and everything triggers everything. Please do not believe that. So they are connected, but not in the way that people think, right? So I hope you liked it. Guys, thanks for liking and hyping. If you want to support the channel, link is in the description. Click the join button for behind the scene videos about my private life. And thank you for supporting the channel with supers. You guys are awesome. Well, be prepared, right? I see you in the next one. Happy Easter, everyone. Bye-bye.